Hello, I'm Paul Levitz, doing my fake British accent on the hello. On Forbidden Planet TV having a conversation about Avengers War Across Time. Time travel to us and check it out.
Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I am Andrew Sumner, and I'm pleased to be joined by an old friend of mine, an old friend of Forbidden Planet, none other than my returning guest, Paul Levitz, the former president and publisher of DC Comics. How are you, Paul?
I'm doing fine, Andrew. Pleasure to be back with you.
And it is great to see you again, mate. Not the least of which, because you can now talk about the thing that you told me you couldn't talk about when you were last on. And that is amazingly the announcement that you're working on your first Marvel project, the Avengers War Across Time. And not only are you working on the Avengers, and not only is Avengers series not a one shot, but you're working on it with the great British illustrator Alan Davis, of Captain Britain fame, of clandestine fame, of fame full stop. So what an amazing project. What can you tell me about it, mate?
So about 2.5 years ago now, 3 years ago, before the plague hit, Mark Wade, who is an old friend and colleague, was at a Marvel Writers Summit and said to the guys, by the way, Levitz isn't exclusive to DC anymore, and he's an old Avengers fan. He'd probably be willing to do something if you'd be willing to have him. And it percolates through whatever their system is. Hell starts having some chunks of ice form in the process. I'm just really surprised no one used a headline on this one that hell freezes over Levitz writes for Marvel.
Yeah, maybe that'll be the title of this episode of Forbidden Planet TV.
Could be. And Tom Brevoort, who I know for many years, but have never had the chance to really play with, calls up and says, really? What would you like to do? And I said, look, I can't do the contemporary characters. I got lost along the way. That's true for DC as well as Marvel. I couldn't write next month's issue of Batman. But I can write the old stuff. I love the old stuff. Can I do a retro something? And he said, sure, come up with an idea. And I pitched a story that's niched right after Avengers 11. And in many ways, it's a love letter to my old friends. Stan and Jack were both friends of mine. Don Heck was a lovely man who drew some stories when I was an editor and who I worked with off and on over the years. Don would always come in with a story shy of the last 2 pages finished. And I'll mail in the last two pages another tomorrow. But he had to make the deadline. He was very serious about that and give the inker something to work on, but he couldn't quite get the pages done in time by that point. So it's a love letter to their work. It gave me an excuse to reread all the early Marvels in sequence so that I could figure out what exactly did Hank and Jan say to each other in those years? What did they think? What did Stan think were cutesy pie, flirtatious language, and what was Thor's grammar that week? I'm not sure. Anything to do with either Old Norse or Old English or just Old Stan.
Yeah.
Copiously making notes. And I start this project, pitch it over there. They're happy with it. We talk about artists. Alan becomes available, which is wonderful. I never had the chance to have him draw anything of mine. I've loved his work since DR and Quinch, which you should have mentioned in the list of his great works.
So true. I should have done.
He has besides the fact that he has grace in his art in general, and you really feel the physical motion of his characters, he has a wonderful skill at human emotion in the faces. And you saw that going back to DR and Quinch early on in his work, when he could have these totally alien faces that had human expression that was very revealing without ever having human anatomy. which is an extraordinarily unusual skill. If he was an animator, he'd conquer the uncanny valley, I think, in 2 minutes flat. Um, so he was available, so we got started. And then the plague hit and everything got shut down. And, understandably, this was not Marvel's top priority project in any of those years. And it got pushed to the side for quite a number of months. And then finally got pushed back on the schedule. And very pleasantly happens to finally have been scheduled just as the Avengers is hitting their 60th anniversary, which gives it a publicity push, an excuse for living, whatever you want to phrase it as, that it would not have had otherwise.
I mean, it is such a wonderful moment for it to be getting published, and to speak to the comments you just made about Alan's artistry, the pages that have been released thus far and the covers that have been released, it looks absolutely gorgeous.
He's a delightful artist to work with. We work a version of Marvel style. I do a more detailed synopsis than Stan used to in his heyday. But I like to leave room for the artist to screw around with it because they're better visual thinkers than I am ultimately, particularly when you get to the choreography of things. And there are wonderful visual moments. There's an American kids game where you take a baseball bat and one kid puts his hand like this, and the next kid puts his hand like this, and whoever ends up with their hand on top wins. And we have a moment like that with Thor and the King of the Dwarfs and the Uru Hammer, and they're fighting for control of it. Because this is the guy who built the Uru Hammer, forged it, however you want to call it. So whether he's worthy or not, he can still hold it. So there's a little bit of an interesting tussle on that. And Alan just brings a moment like that so beautifully to life.
And the whole of the series, it's as you mentioned, it's a continuity insert, if you will. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So
it's Avengers issue 11.1.
Brilliant.
Something like that. So in Avengers 11, for those of you who were not around then, Kang sends a Spider-Man robot back in time to fight the Avengers, and they think it's Spider-Man at first. In a classic Stan Lee, the good guys have to have an excuse to fight, and they run around doing all of this in the wilds of Mexico, and eventually the robot gets defeated, and the Avengers are ready to go back to New York. Well, Kang's not finished with them, and I try to establish at least a mild rationale for why Kang is preoccupied with this particular moment in time, since he has a choice of all of it. And he's up to no good again, doing something evil and awful that involves all of the original Avengers, including the Hulk, in issue 11.1, if you will. And it progresses from there. The Avengers ultimately deciding they have to go to the future to fight Kang. So they go to the Baxter building where the FF has their Dr. Doom's time machine. Willie Lumpkin shows up. Brilliant. As part of it. You've got moments with Betty Brant buying a newspaper from the newsstand. Other Marvel characters who you wouldn't necessarily expect showing up for a panel or two in a typical Stan and Jack kind of moment, with them dropping by. And everything doesn't work out as neatly as the Avengers would like along the way. So this goes on for a few more issues than it probably would have if Stan was writing it.
Well, mate, you're making my head, as an old DC fan, as an old Marvel fan, as a long-time fan of your work, long-time fan of Alan's, you're making my head explode with this description. That's fantastic. How many issues is it going to be?
So it's published as 5 issues. The first one is a double issue, so it'll be 40 pages. It was written as the first 2 chapters originally.
Yeah.
And then the others are traditional 20-page issues.
Fantastic. And in terms of, so we've talked as to the continuity insert element of it. Um, and is there anybody that you would have liked to have got to work with in terms of the cast list of the book that you weren't able to include?
Well, you're going to a moment,
Yes.
so it's got everybody from who appeared in Avengers 1 through 15
Yeah.
in it, pretty much. Um, we have the Lava Men showing up for a moment. We have Rick Jones showing up for a moment. We have Willie Lumpkin wasn't in the Avengers in that period, but he was certainly already in the Marvel stuff. I guess Stan had originally created him for a newspaper strip project that he was hawking that never went anywhere, and he stayed in love with it. But Willie sort of was Stan's early cameo for himself, and tried to channel a little extra of Stan in the 2 minutes of Willie wandering through. Uh,
Wonderful.
I love the next sequence of the Avengers, the post issue 16 team, and who knows if this succeeds? Maybe they'll let me play with that as a follow up.
That would be great if you got to play around with that lineup as well. I mean, surely
Yeah,
that'll be another dream come true.
it would be fun to have the snarky version of Hawkeye and
Yeah.
um, the speech patterns that Stan devised and the emotional patterns for the four of them at that time just had so much raw material in it, and he exploited an awful lot of it, but there's plenty left to do. We'll see.
That really would be wonderful. I mean, I think it's very interesting the way timing has worked out, not only in terms of the 60th anniversary, but of course you're debuting a book where the one of the where the key villain is Kang, just at the point where Kang rises to the fore in the MCU. I don't think you could have timed that any better.
No inside information in the process. He's clearly the most interesting villain in the first 16 issues of the Avengers. Loki's a wonderful character, but he's a Thor character. He's not an
Yeah.
Avengers character at the end of the day, notwithstanding everything that they did cinematically, which was so wonderful. Hiddleston's performance on
So
that
wonderful. Yeah.
astounding. Probably the most interesting performance in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So when you look over those 16, most of the villains are borrowed from the individual characters' stories. That's okay. That's a traditional thing. But Kang is the classic Avengers villain of that moment, I think. And so it was ideal to bring him in and make him the dynamic. And I kind of like time travel, as you might know from my other work. So
Yes.
it
I'm
was
aware of that. Yeah. I think it's great that you've had the chance to do this. Who of that classic Avengers lineup, um, who's A, your favourite character if you have one, and B, who did you enjoy writing the most?
I don't know that I have a favorite character out of the group, aside from what the stories were that they did in the days. I think Thor was probably the most interesting character in terms of the work that Stan and Jack did with him, the way they played with all of the mythological dimension and all of Asgard in it. That's not really reflected very heavily in the Avengers material, but I think as a reader, that's what grabbed me the most. In terms of writing, I think the Wasp is the most fun. She just gets the cutest lines in the process, whether it's flirting with Thor or getting creeped out by Iron Man's outfit. She's a more human character than most of them, and Iron Man at that stage of his incarnation is so busy pretending not to be Tony that his emotions are packed in the iron too. So you don't get to see a tremendous amount. Cap is always wonderful fun. He's such an iconic character in the process, but he doesn't have too much room to be that when he's surrounded by Thor and Iron Man and their incredible power. Hank's okay, but he's a foil.
Yeah.
He's really a straight man for Jan at this point, I think, more than anything else.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a line feeder almost, isn't he?
yeah. Um, the ladies just get the best lines in the deal. We kind of show up and they tease us.
Yeah, they always struck me as kind of the comic book equivalent of Nick and Nora Charles.
Absolutely. That's clearly what Stan's channeling in the process.
I imagine a lot of the readership that wasn't evident at the time, but it's such a wonderful thing to base their relationship on.
Well, I mean, remember that when this stuff comes out, and that's I guess one of the challenges in doing a nostalgia piece like this. Stan's writing for 12-year-olds. And he's writing for 12-year-olds of the 1960s who didn't have access to a smartphone, didn't have access to every movie that was ever made on Netflix and WB Plus and Disney Plus and Puppy Dog Plus and whatever the hell they're going to announce tomorrow morning. So we were a much more ignorant crowd culturally. We were growing up more narrowly. So he could borrow from places like The Thin Man, and there was not a prayer of any kid spotting it or understanding it. And it's not a terrible thing, even if you know it. You kind of smile and say, yeah, it's nice to see those guys back again.
Wow, it's
Um,
lovely. Yeah.
but he had a real cultural freedom in all of it. Um, he could play with Thor's pseudo Shakespearean, whatever the hell dialect that really is. But we weren't reading any Shakespeare, so we didn't know what that was. So it was just, this is strange and cool, and this must have been how they spoke back in the old days. We've lost something in the world in losing the naivete that our generation had. In a sense, I guess I don't know how to measure it in generations, but you have a very short window of time between the beginnings of radio and television as mass media and the birth of the internet, where you had kids growing up with some connection to the wider world and some knowledge of science, but not an unlimited knowledge. And I think we were less cynical than the generation that followed us because we didn't have access to that knowledge. And it was a more exciting time because we could discover all of these things. And the thrill of discovery was so powerful between the 1950s, the 1960s, even the 1970s, and maybe the early 80s.
Yeah.
And you see that reflected in the comics of those years, that the creators would put things in that had reference points in other places, stolen from other parts of popular culture, influenced from other parts of popular culture, their own additions to it. The vast body of Jack's work. Jack was this probably the most imaginative guy that we ever had working in American comics. He was an enormous processor of culture and science, and he would, I don't know how, I was just debating this with Evanier the other night. I don't know how Jack found the time with the amount of pages he did, but he would read, whether it was scientific magazines or popular magazines, and he'd come upon these ideas and he'd be fascinated by it, and he'd find a way to twist it in and bring it into the material in a fashion. And like with all great creative people, X% of the ideas were brilliant, Y% of them, please. I'm not a great fan of the Black Racer.
Well, it's the Black Race is fundamentally ridiculous, and kind of I know you'll know the inside that because there's that famous Evanier story about, which no doubt is the truth, about him trying to persuade Jack not to introduce the racer as quickly as he did, and all of that stuff, but he just couldn't help himself.
Yeah, I mean that was how Jack's mind worked, and he could bring all of this in, and the Silver Surfer could be this amazing character. Stan finding a way to give him an identity, personality on top of what Jack had put in there. The two of them collaborating brilliantly, whether consciously or not. That doesn't work quite the same way anymore, because the kids we have now are exposed to so much. They know more at my grandson knows more at 4 years old in terms of raw information than I knew at 7 or 8, probably. Um, it's just, you can't speak to them in the same language, and that's kind of a shame. But the world changes, the world evolves.
Now, I agree, and as ever, that's very well observed and thought through, Paul. Before we depart, can you remember when we've talked previously about your first introduction to comic books and when you first became a comics reader? But can you remember when you first encountered the Avengers?
So I was restricted in the number of comics I could buy per week. So I was only allowed 3 comics a week. And as a early Superman fan, and the DC's got better distribution in my area of Brooklyn than any other publisher, there were enough DCs to buy. So I didn't buy any Marvel comics for a long time. Other kids on the block had some. And I remember seeing, I think it's Avengers 28, with a wonderful looming Goliath behind the 4 on the cover, in an older friend's box of comics that he had in his garage, which was mostly a DC box, but had a couple of issues of Spider-Man. That may have been the only Avengers issue that I got to look at and read. And it was interesting, but it wasn't interesting enough that I was ready to throw over the Justice League and the other options for it. When my dad took off a week from work, when I was graduating public school, he was the unusually male president of the Parent Teacher Association for my school, so he was involved in some of the graduation events. He didn't really give a damn about this restriction on number of comics. He was an old Doc Savage fan from the pulp days, hadn't been a comic book fan, but understood my relationship with the characters. I was already 11, I guess, so that it was pretty clear that I was a good reader of all sorts of things, and the comics were not hurting me, other than possibly my vision. But so I was able to buy more comics, and I was able to get an issue of Avengers, and that was the Marvel that really pulled out to me. I wrote a piece on my website the other week that I realized in doing this Avengers project that as a reader, what attracted me to comics was the multiplicity of characters. I always liked the group books best, and also the diversity of costumes. I never got into the Fantastic Four, despite having one friend up the block who collected it and loudly told me it was better than the Legion of Superheroes. He might have been right, but it didn't work for me. And the reason, I think, ultimately was they all had the same costume. And I see this issue of the Avengers, it had the Masters of Evil in it. So you had 4 or 5 Avengers in different costumes and 4 or 5 villains in different costumes. Okay, that's fine. I'll go for this. And I never looked back and began to collect the Avengers. I indexed the Avengers in one of my early fanzines, probably the first 60 issues or something like that. I studied who was in each issue and how it transformed, and just never got to play with them professionally until now.
And what a wonderful and glorious coda to all of that, to be able to be in the place you are now, talking to me about the comic book you've written.
I've just been so lucky. I mean, I made it to my second visit to Stan's house before bringing along my bound volume of Avengers 1 to 16 and saying, I'm going to be a grown-up at dinner with Joni, but, could you please sign this for my inner 12-year-old now?
Yes.
And that's probably the prized possession I have in my collection of 40,000 comics.
That is absolutely lovely, mate. I'm tempted to close this out there, but I want to ask you one final question, which is related to Avengers lore, which is What did you think of Avengers Endgame? What were highlights of that movie, that achievement for you?
Well, I mean, the joy in it is seeing that the technology is able to bring the things to life in ways that it couldn't. You always have to change who the characters are a little bit. You have to change the dynamic of the stories to make it work. They've Feige and his team have clearly done an astounding job of creative work. I probably know how difficult that is better than almost any human being on earth. So my respect for him may be deeper. It's certainly more specifically connected to, yeah, I understand how that wound got on you, sir, and how you kept fighting despite it. Um, my my hat's off to you for succeeding in ways that perhaps I was not able to. Um, so most of it is just the sheer joy of how did you pull that off? I know it's impossible, and yet you did it. And it's, there's a little piece of sort of, I don't really think the Scarlet Witch is a stronger wizard than Doctor Strange. I'm not buying that moment. I'm not sure. I wouldn't have done that bit. But that's, again, that's the 12-year-old. That's the continuity freak in it, just arguing about.
The 12-year-old hardcore comics fan. I
Yeah.
think what's particularly interesting for me and joyful in the same way as it is for you about that initial 22 film run and what they did in creating an event. I mean, it was an amazing moment when 5 films in, they created a successful Avengers movie. That was, to me, was at the time was unbelievable. I was like, man, I cannot believe they've pulled that off. And then to be saying the same thing again another 7 or 8 years later, when I loved Infinity, but when I came out of Endgame, it's like I cannot believe they pulled it, all the disparate threads of that movie. I remember the criticism that Peter Jackson got for Return of the King for having multiple endings,
Mm.
and it's like there's many things going on in Endgame, but one of the lessons learned is it has multiple endings and they all kind of work, which I found incredible. But sitting in the cinema and watching a cinema not full of comics fans, full of regular people in my home city. Actually, I saw it for the first time with my son up in Liverpool, and an audience just full of regular moviegoers. And that moment where Cap grabs hold of Thor's hammer, the whole cinema erupted, and people like jumped up and stood up and were clapping and cheering. I thought, man, the 10-year-old me is just can't believe what he's seeing. I found that incredible.
It's joyous. And as I say, I have a really good idea of how difficult that is. Um, and
No one more than you, right, mate?
if it's a really short list of people who've been on that battlefield as much.
Yeah.
And it's joyous and astounding.
And equally joyous to me, and almost as astounding to me as a long time fan of your work, that you're where you are now, creating the book you've just created, and that we're chatting about it. And I wish you all the success with War Across Time, which I'm sure you're going to have, because it's a beautiful culmination of creative talent and opportunity, and the timing of it, as we've touched upon, just couldn't be better. I have been talking with the great Paul Levitz about the Avengers War Across Time, which everybody watching this and savouring this conversation can buy from the links attached to our conversation.
And I hope you enjoy it. It would especially delight me if people had fun with it, and it got a little bit of buzz. One of the things I miss most as a writer these days is the old letter columns and seeing
Yeah.
all the stacks of letters. I always used to do the letter columns for my own books, regardless of who the editor was or how, so that just so I could read all the feedback. Um, hopefully this will give people a fun moment.
I'm sure it will, mate. And I think you've touched upon something quite elemental about the letters pages. when I read back issues, which I do frequently, one of the things I think I enjoy the letters pages as much as I enjoy reading the actual comics. You know, they're such a time capsule these days, right?
Well, and particularly going back and rereading all those old Marvels, the number of people who were letter writers who ended up working on the material. I will close out from my end offering up my credentials. The Lucite
Oh, look at that.
1969 no prize, fading a little bit from the sunlight over the years. You know, so many of us who were in those early letter columns ended up writing material, whether it was for Marvel or DC, or, you know, George R.R. Martin creating the Game of Thrones material. And for whatever reason, the kids who were reading those comics included an awful lot of people who had their own creative spirits. And it's so much fun to have spent a life pursuing that. And it is great fun to have been able to do this, returning to one of my childhood fascinations in a way that I frankly didn't expect I would get the opportunity to do. I gave up on the probability of writing for Marvel around 1990. And obviously I gave up too soon.
There we go. There we go. Amen to that, Paul. So this has been Forbidden Planet TV, and this has been the one and only Paul Levitz talking to me about, of all things, his new Avengers book, which I think is a glorious thing. Thank you very much for joining us, Paul.
My pleasure.
Great to see you, mate.
Take care.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.